Thank you very much. So thank you for inviting me. As I say, I'm from University of Liverpool and also the new ESRC Lucid Centre, which is a collaboration between Manchester, Lancaster and Liverpool universities to look at research on language acquisition. Now, when I was asked to give a talk on nativism, I was a little bit worried because I'm not a nativist. I would consider myself a constructivist. And I said to my Facebook friends, what shall I talk about? And I'm afraid some of them said, just say there's no such thing as innate knowledge over and over and over again for 60 minutes. And I considered that and I thought, well, actually, I don't necessarily believe that. And as well as being a constructivist, I am a scientist, I hope. So what I want to do is actually argue that a lot of my Facebook friends may well be wrong, and there may be something such a thing as innate knowledge, but I'm not sure, and we need to look empirically to get at that. But what I want to do really today for the next hour, so for the next 60 minutes, is talk about the nature-nurture debate in language acquisition research. And what I want to argue is, although the debate itself is a potentially very productive framework for scientific investigation, it really hasn't worked very well in language acquisition research. And for many of the same reasons that we heard about before the break, that it hasn't really worked that well in theory of mind research either. And the reason is that there are fundamental disagreements between nativists and constructivists over fundamental issues, over the issue of what could plausibly be innate, over the issue of how to interpret the evidence, and over the issue of what is the role of the environment. And I want to argue that these things have actually been quite frustrating, as you found, because we haven't really come much further forward in our knowledge of what are the cognitive mechanisms that underlie language acquisition, which is the question that we're interested in. However, we have actually, in language acquisition, come to a little bit more of a consensus than perhaps maybe theory of mind field has. And actually, in recent years, I think there is ground to be optimistic. So the second half of my talk is going to be about where I think we've come to a consensus in what is potentially innate, in how to interpret the evidence, in the role of environment. So I am actually feeling much more positive about the future of my field than I was maybe 10, 15 years ago. So this is the outline of my talk. But let's start with the nature-nurture debate. Can I just check, if you put your hand up if you do something or you know something about language here, and what if you know something about language acquisition? Okay, so most people. So there are a few people that don't. So I would say if I talk about something like argument-predicate relationship and you have no idea what that is, please do put your hand up and ask me. But I will try and explain some of the linguistic concepts as I go through them. Okay, so nature-nurture in language acquisition. This is a field that basically dominates most of the subfields of language acquisition. This debate between what is encoded in our genetic code that enables us to learn language, the debate between nature, and the debate between the nurture argument, so the role of the environment. And it occurs in all different areas. So if you think about phonological learning, the learning of speech sounds like bat and cat and da, we have two theories. Again, we have a nativist theory, such as the motor theory of speech perception. So Lieberman suggested that we may have a universal inventory of articulatory features that map onto the speech sounds that we hear. So our process of learning speech sounds is to map what we can hear onto this universal inventory of articulatory gestures. So, for example, movements of the tongue, movements of the mouth, etc. So these are all sort of pre-specified in our genes. More recent theories, such as Cole's attunement theory, are less radical than we actually have all of these speech sounds universally. But there's still some idea that innately in our genes is specified something that some sort of constraint about how to roughly partition sounds. On the other hand, we have Pierre Humboldt, who argues that we don't need any of that innate knowledge at all. In fact, what we can, in order to learn to categorize speech sounds, she argues that actually you could build up a sound system categories on the basis of your language from the bottom up via distributional analysis of the input. Do you want to sit on a chair? I don't mind if you can't sit on a chair. Sorry. So Pierre Humboldt says, she argues that you can just categorize speech sounds based on the distributional analysis of the input. And in fact, there is evidence that children can use distributional analysis to categorize speech sounds. We have the same debate in word learning. So obviously we have something like constraints theory that argues that children are born with constraints that determine how they assign meanings to words. So for example, well, they are maybe born with a whole object assumption. So this is the assumption that a novel word will refer to a whole object as opposed to a part or a property of the object. So if you hear the word dog for the first time and you see a fluffy little animal running around, you will assume that the word dog refers to the whole animal rather than, say, the dog's fur or the dog's leg, for example. So there's that on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have constructivists who argue that no, you don't need any of that innate constraint nonsense. You can just do it by other means. So Linda Smith has been arguing that you can just do it by what she calls attentional learning. If you're just paying attention to the co-occurrence of the word and an object in the environment or a meaning in the environment, over multiple instances of hearing that word co-occurring with that object, you can work out that the word means that object. Or Eve Clark and Mike Tomasello have suggested socio-pragmatic learning. So the key here is to figure out the communicative intent of the speaker. If you know what the speaker intends to say, you can figure out what the word means. And then finally, where the debate has been fiercest, probably, is in grammar learning. So obviously we have nativist theories of grammar learning. So for example, Pinker has argued that children are born with innate knowledge of syntactic syntactic roles like subject and object, and they're born with innate knowledge of semantic roles like agent and patient, and they're born with innate linking rules that allow them to link syntactic roles and semantic roles. Or we have Himes, who suggested a parameter theories and model of learning. So the idea behind learning is to set innate parameters to your languages, set the innate parameters of your language to the right setting. And then obviously there's constructivism. So we've got Brain, we've got Maratzas, we've got Ellman, we've got Tomasello, who are arguing that, again, you don't need any of that innate knowledge. You can learn grammar by, for example, semantic distribution analysis, by paying attention to the regularities and the co-occurrence of words in your input. You can build up the grammatical categories and the grammatical rules in that way. So the nature-nurture debate basically covers the whole spectrum of most of the whole spectrum of language acquisition. So in theory, the nature-nurture debate should actually be a really productive way of investigating language acquisition. So if Popper is correct, then the ability to pit two opposing scientific theories against each other should actually be pretty productive. So for example, if the predictions of the two competing theories can be tested, the theory that fails to predict the input, to predict an output will be modified or will be dropped. The successful theory will survive and go on to be tested against other theories. And then through a process of iteration, each theory will become more fit for purpose. Each theory should become more accurate, and each theory should get better at explaining the data. So in theory, this divide that we have, where we should be able to pit two opposing theories against each other, should actually be pretty productive. In theory, because in practice it's rubbish. It just doesn't work in my field. And I think, so I spent ages thinking about why doesn't it work. But basically, I think the reason it doesn't work is we have these three fundamental disagreements that I'm going to tell you about now. We disagree about what is potentially innate, we disagree about how to interpret the evidence, and we disagree about the role of the environment. Or in the past, we have disagreed about these things. So conflict one is what might plausibly be innate. This is a big point of conflict because in language acquisition, the nativist argument in the past has been simply that syntactic knowledge must be innate. So many language acquisition theorists coming from a nativist perspective will just simply refuse to accept that innate knowledge can be anything but syntactic. And the reasoning goes, that is sort of based on a three-point logical argument chain. The first point in the logical argument chain is that grammar is independent of meaning. So the argument starts with this idea that what children are learning, or the end product of learning, is an abstract syntax system that exists independently of meaning. And this obviously comes from, say, Chomsky's idea. So if you take his famous sentence, colourless green ideas sleep furiously, this sentence is grammatical, despite being meaningless, unattested in any corpus, and statistically improbable. So on this basis, Chomsky argued that because you can have sentences such as this that are grammatical, this means that grammar must be independent of meaning. If grammar is independent of meaning, the grammar system that children are learning must be independent of meaning. So it must be a kind of abstract, independent, autonomous syntax system. So the first step in the chain is to say this is what children are learning. The second step in the chain is to say it's actually impossible to learn this system from the input alone. So this is what's famously called the poverty of the stimulus argument. What children are learning is an abstract syntax system full of grammatical categories and grammatical rules. What children are hearing is a string of lexical items. And according to nativist theorizing, you can't get from a string of lexical items to a hierarchical knowledge of grammatical categories. And you can't get to it because the information that you would need to get from one to the other isn't in the input. So, for example, if you take the classic example of anaphoric 1, anaphoric 1 in English refers to a noun phrase rather than to a noun itself. So if you have the sentence, I'll play with this red ball, you play with that one refers back to the red ball rather than just the ball itself. Now, the argument from the poverty of the stimulus is that you cannot learn that from your input, because every time you come across a sentence where one refers back to the red ball, it also could potentially refer back to the ball. So you never come across evidence in your input or in your environment that tells you which is the right referent for the anaphoric 1. And people have demonstrated this by looking at the input to children. So the idea here is that because you don't have that evidence in your input, it means that you must, if you're going to learn anaphoric 1, you must be somehow doing it with innate knowledge. You are constrained only to consider a subset of the hypotheses, and you're not misled because you're not considering the wrong hypotheses. So we have two things. Grammar is an independent autonomous syntax system. Children are learning this independent autonomous syntax system, which is impossible to learn from the input. And the third step in the chain is the argument that it's impossible to bootstrap into autonomous syntax from other categories. So some people may, so for example, Schlesinger has said, well, okay, yeah, right, you might need something innate to learn language, but it doesn't have to be syntax. It could be maybe semantic categories. So you could have an innate agent category or innate action category, and then you map that onto syntax in your learning. So that's the possibility that maybe, you could bootstrap from semantics or from something else into syntax. But as Maratsos famously showed back in the 1980s, it's probably unlikely that you can do that because semantic categories don't map onto syntactic categories. So you find nouns that denote actions, so you can't map actions to verbs because then you've got the nouns miscategorized. You have adjectives that are actional, so quick and fast, and again, if you were trying to bootstrap from semantics to syntax, you'd miscategorize some of these adjectives. And then you have verbs that denote properties, so resemble. So again, if you were bootstrapping from action to verb, you would misattribute verbs like resemble. So this is the logical argument train that I come across over and over again in nativist theories of language acquisition. We know that you must have an innate knowledge of syntactic categories and rules because you can't learn them. And because you can't learn them and you can't bootstrap into them from anything else. On the other hand, we have the constructivists who completely dispute that whole argument chain. So we have I'm going to summarize 3 areas of disagreement. The first, quite fundamental disagreement is about the nature of the system being learned. So a lot of nativists will assume, as I say, that what you're learning is an abstract autonomous syntax system, but a lot of constructivists will say, hang on a minute, no you're not, you're learning something else. So if you take Adele Goldberg and Bill Croft, they've argued that what's the end point of acquisition is actually a construction grammar. So what a construction grammar is what you're learning is simply an inventory of form-meaning paired constructions. And these can be constructions at any level. So for example, you might be learning semi-abstract constructions such as I want X, where X the X slot can be filled in by a whole load of different nouns or noun phrases. And that I1X semi-abstract construction is associated with the meaning to express a desire for something. So you're just learning this form-meaning pairing. Or they could be fully abstract. So the transitive, so the subject, verb, object, word order in English could simply be a construction that you learn when you want to say something about A acting upon B, causing B to be affected in some way. Now, of course, if children are learning construction grammar, the poverty of the stimulus argument no longer applies. You're not learning an abstract autonomous syntax system, you're learning a construction grammar. There is plenty of evidence in the input to learn a construction grammar. So that's the sort of first point of disagreement between the two. The second point of disagreement is about the poverty of the stimulus. There are hundreds of papers, some done by people in this room, that dispute the poverty of the stimulus argument. So let's take our example of anaphoric 1. There are there are a number of different ways where you could argue that actually the evidence about how to interpret anaphoric 1 is in the input. I'm going to talk about 3. The first one is that it actually isn't absent at all. It isn't very frequent, that's true, but the evidence about how to correctly interpret it is actually there. So Naomi Akhtar and some colleagues calculated how many times Nina and Peter, whose data is available in the child's corpus, will have heard unambiguous sentences that tell you what the correct interpretation of anaphoric 1 is. And they calculate that by the age of 3, they will have heard about 33 unambiguous sentences. Now, you can argue about what you can learn from 33 unambiguous sentences, but the point is that the evidence is not absent, it is actually there. And the evidence constitutes sentences like this one: Chris has a red ball, but Max doesn't have one, uttered in a situation where Max has a blue ball. So that is quite unambiguously saying if Max doesn't have one, that one must be referring back to a red ball. Another solution is to generalize from other pronouns. So, for example, Pearl and Miss have a Bayesian model which can learn the correct interpretation of anaphoric 1 by generalizing from other pronouns such as it or him or her, which are actually quite frequent in the input. So as long as your system is happy to generalize from it to 1, then you can learn that pronouns like it and pronouns like 1 are actually referring to the noun phrase rather than the noun itself. Or actually, in a kind of Tomasello type way, you could simply use conversational implicature. So you could use sort of an intention meaning sort of explanation. So, for example, if you're told, hand me a yellow bottle, and then you're told, now give me another one, well, you might assume that if yellow wasn't important to the situation, then the person wouldn't have asked for a yellow bottle. They would have omitted the word yellow. If it wasn't important to their meaning, then they wouldn't have put it in there. And therefore, the implication here is that when you're talking about another one, you're talking about another yellow bottle. So you might be able to use your sort of reading of the intention of the speaker in order to work out the meaning of anaphoric 1. So constructivists dispute 2 of the premises in the logical argument chain, but actually they also dispute the idea that what has to be innate is innate knowledge at all. So there must be something that's innate, okay? So there must be something unique to humans that enables us to learn languages. We know it has to be unique to our brain because no matter how much you try, it's really hard to get chimpanzees to produce complex grammatical sentences. So we know that something is innate, but it doesn't have to be knowledge necessarily. And Jeff Ellman has suggested in the Rethinking, and colleagues have suggested in the Rethinking Innateness book, that what might be innate is architectural constraints. So it may be that the genes specify a blueprint that means the human brain is structured in such a way that it can learn language. So we may be talking about the structure of the brain as opposed to knowledge in the brain. And or we could have chronotopic constraints, so for example that constrain the timing of development. So there may well be a genetic code that constrains when certain mechanisms are turned on or when they're sensitive to different bits of environmental information so that they are turned on at the right point in development. So what we have here is 2 different conceptions about what could plausibly be innate. And in the past, this has led to frustration. Ken Wexler once told me that Mike Tomasello was a charlatan, so it doesn't just end up in professional frustration, it ends up in personal frustration as well. And the frustration stems from the fact that constructivists keep trying to prove that you can do without innate knowledge. And they're really frustrated when nativists just say, oh, poverty of the stimulus. And nativists are frustrated by the fact that constructivists keep trying to do without innate knowledge and won't pay attention to them when they say, hey, poverty of the stimulus. So there has been a little bit of a problem there. I'm going to move away from that one. The second problem that we have is that these different interpretations of what the learning task is, so what we're learning, means that the same body of evidence is often interpreted in very different ways, depending on the theoretical orientation of the researcher. So let's take something like the determiner category. In 1986, Virginia Valian produced a paper which suggested some really empirical objective criteria by which you would attribute a determiner category to a child. So what she said is that you can determine, you can you can say that a child has a knowledge of the determiner category if they pass these three criteria. If they always use determiners in the correct position, so they never say, A, that's dog, they say that's a dog. If they never use determiners in isolation, so if you never get children saying the or ah, and if they always sequence them correctly. So if you never get children saying, that's the dog. If children satisfy those three criteria, she argued that then that suggests that they have already acquired the determiner category. And what she showed in her evidence from the Childers database is that children pass these criteria between the age of 2 and 2.5. Hello? Yeah. A determiner is oh God, it's Linguistics 101. I'm going to get this wrong. Let me say I'm a psychologist and a linguist before I say this. Right, so a determiner is a function word that, okay, so I'm going to, in layman's terms, a determiner is one of those little words that comes before a noun that specifies what sort of definite or indefinite. So you can say a dog, which means there is a dog, look, there's a dog, or you can say the dog, which means look, there's the dog that I've already talked about. So you can also call them articles, but there's lots of them. There's some, there's a, there's the, anything that you kind of put before a noun or an adjective to specify what it is. Does that make sense? You don't get them in every language, but we really need them in English. Is that okay? Thank you. Anyway, so Valian basically argued that children between the age of 2 and 2.5 always satisfy these criteria. So she suggested that children have acquired the determiner category very early, which to her suggested that they have probably acquired it with innate knowledge. But Pine and Martindale, about 10 years later, suggested that actually the problem with Valian's criteria is they only hold if you make a baseline assumption that children are working with abstract syntactic categories. So these criteria only hold if you assume that what they are learning or building up is abstract knowledge. In fact, you can pass her criteria simply with a whole load of little low-scope, lexically specific formulae. So if we assume that children are not learning an abstract category but are learning how to use the word a, they could well simply be building up these low-scope formulae on the basis of the input. So they could learn that's a x and know that you can put a whole load of words in the x slot. And they could also learn there's the y and know that you can put a whole load of different words in the y slot. And you could actually pass all of Valian's criteria just with knowledge of those two lexically specific low-scope formulae. So you're always going to get the at and the in the correct position because that's specified in the formulae. You're never going to use at and the in isolation because you're going to use them in the formulae. And you're never going to sequence them incorrectly because you're using them in the formulae. So the criteria don't unambiguously prove that children have abstract knowledge of the determiner. So the problem here is that we've got different interpretations of the evidence based on different assumptions about what the child is learning and what the child must be learning.
You have to know what X or Y is, right?
You have to know what can go in that category, yeah. And that, there is generalization, absolutely, yeah, definitely. The third conflict is to do with the role of the environment. So the poverty of the stimulus argument and the no negative evidence argument, which is basically the fact that children make errors that are never corrected, and that's absolutely true. Children do make errors that are never corrected. Actually, children make errors that you correct and they argue with you. My daughter did this till she was 9. She would say "rund" all the time, and I would being a psycholinguist, I would correct her all the time, say it's ran. She would argue back, it's not ran, it's rund, all the time. So we know that children ignore you when you try and correct their grammatical errors, even if you are a bit of an obsessive linguist and you try and correct their grammatical errors. So for nativism, the role of the environment isn't that important. We know that, if you're learning abstract syntax, an abstract syntax system, that the information in the environment is not going to tell you how to learn that system. And also when people provide you with information, you ignore it, or most of the time people don't provide you with information. So nativists have often really minimized the role of the environment in language acquisition and haven't really paid that much attention to it. So those people who have paid attention to it tend to talk about, in terms of the environment, triggering the correct setting of parameters, for example. So in 1986, Himes suggested that there was a pro-drop parameter that governed whether or not your language took obligatory subjects. So in English, you have to say he or it. So you have to say it's raining, for example, or he's going to the park. In Italian, you don't. You can just say going to the park or raining. So you can drop the subject in some languages. And so for Himes, the question of acquisition was working out what parameter your language took, whether you could drop the subject or whether it was obligatory. And for her, the role of the input was simply to trigger that parameter. And there were certain cues in the input that would trigger that parameter. So for example, hearing it's raining in English would trigger you to set the parameter to the obligatory subject setting, because it's unnecessary. In Italian, you don't need it. It doesn't really refer to any kind of object. It's not really a thing. And so hearing this would trigger the pro-drop parameter. So all children are doing it with their environment, according to Himes, is they're monitoring it for cues, to parameter setting cues. And as soon as you hear that parameter setting cue, you trigger your parameter setting. Or you have Valiant, who argues there's rather a large amount of innate knowledge and innate categories and innate movement rules inside the genome, and that the role for the environment is simply to allow you to map these innate categories onto specific language. So you have a noun category, you just got to work out what words are nouns in your language. Or you know that your language might take movement rules, and so you've got to work out whether it does or not. So really minimizing the role of the environment. Of course, on the other hand, the constructivists see a central role for the environment. So because they have different views about the nature of what is being learned and about the nature of innate knowledge, the input is absolutely key. And in grammar learning, something like regularities in the input drive acquisition. So if you take Tomasello and Lieben's usage-based model, they argue, for 4-domain general mechanisms. A semantic distributional analyzer which exploits the regularities in the input of grammar. So regularities like the fact that verbs will tend to occur in the same distributional position in the sentence. You exploit the regularities of the grammar to link together words that behave in similar ways, and that's how you build, say, a noun category or a verb category. You're basing everything on your input, these regularities in your input. Another mechanism is an analogical reasoner. So you are analyzing across different lexical specific formula, for example, to build up a more abstract category. So the process of analogy across different instances is very important. So again, hearing lots of input is absolutely crucial. And then things like competition, so competition between what you predict and what you actually hear, guides learning. And obviously for Mike Tomasello in particular, intention reading is crucial. You can only work out what you have to, in order to learn grammar, you have to work out what a sentence means. And in order to work out what a sentence means, you have to read the communicative intent of the speaker. So lots and lots of input so that you get better at reading the speaker's communicative intent is absolutely crucial. But again, this led to frustration. So you had nativists on the one hand saying, input doesn't matter, environment doesn't matter, we're not interested in it. And on the other hand, you have constructivists saying, input's absolutely central, it's absolutely important, we must pay attention to it. And again, these different approaches to how important the input was or how important the environment was really did lead to a lot of frustration on both sides. So on a number of really fundamental issues, nativists and constructivists were just simply not singing from the same hymn sheet. And in the most extreme cases, this has actually really led to a lack of communication. So when I came into the field in the 90s, giving away my age, they weren't talking to each other. So constructivists and nativists were going to different conferences. So nativists would go to Gala, constructivists would go to IASCL. They were publishing in different journals, so the nativists would maybe publish in Language Acquisition, the constructivists would publish in JCL, they even stopped citing each other's papers. So you would find nativists citing other nativists and constructivists citing other constructivists, and nobody talking to each other. And of course, what this did is it encouraged confirmation bias in your theories. If you're not testing your theory's predictions against the predictions of an alternative theory, you're never going to get anywhere. So we had a maintenance of the theoretical status quo rather than a kind of vigorous testing of people's theories. But I think there has been a bit of a change, and a bit of a change in attitudes. And it's not clear what stimulated this change in attitudes. I first came aware of it in 2004 when the organising committee of Boston University Conference on Language Development invited Mike Tomasello to debate Stephen Crane in a symposium, which was really, really good fun. And what happened there is that BUCLD had traditionally been seen as a nativist conference, so we didn't go. But we went that year, and we have continued to go. So at BUCLD that year and in years since, nativists and constructivists have really started to engage with each other on a personal basis and start to think about the differences between their theories and what are the points of commonalities. So I do think we're getting a new consensus on what is innate or what is potentially innate, how to interpret the evidence, and the role of the environment. And I'm going to spend the next about 20-25 minutes talking about what I think has happened with this sea change. Okay, consensus about what might be innate. So I think we have had some movement on the question of what types of knowledge may plausibly be innate. And there are new theories on the nature of innate knowledge that seem to be, to me anyway, less polarized with more points of agreement. So to take an example, I want to take this example of how to explain how children learn to interpret English transitive sentences. And English transitive sentences with novel verbs. Novel verbs is really important. You can't use like constructivist lexically specific frames to interpret sentences with novel verbs because you don't have a frame on which to base your question. So I don't know, if you're interpreting the bunny kicked the duck, you might be using a kick frame. You might know how to use kick and be able to interpret the sentence. Whereas if I give you the word blick, the bunny is blicking the duck, you can't use any kind of blick frame to interpret that sentence. So you have to be able to work out that to work out what the sentence means, you need to know that English is SVO. You need to know that English has subject, verb, object, agent, action, patient. The person at the beginning, the bunny, is the person doing the blicking. The person at the end of the sentence, the duck, is the person being blicked. And basically, 2-year-olds can interpret these transitives correctly. So here's a graph from Claire Noble's cognitive science paper in 2011. This was a pointing study where you basically just asked for children to point to where the bunny is sticking the duck, and you get 2-year-olds, 2.5-year-olds, 3-year-olds, and 4-year-olds passing the study. So I'm going to show you what the study looks like. You basically show, I think this is running, but it should work now. Come on, yes. Okay, so you basically show children 2 pictures, one where a bunny is doing something to a duck, one where a bunny and the duck are doing things independently but simultaneously, and you simply say to them in your best child-directed speech, I'm going to try that now, look, the bunny is glorping the duck. oh, look, can you point to where the bunny is glorping the duck? And you give the kids a sticker and you get them to point or stick the sticker on your laptop where the bunny is glorping the duck. And you end up with a really sticky laptop screen, but you get some really great results. And you get 2-year-olds doing this perfectly happily. So what needs to be explained is the fact that 2-year-olds seem to have an abstract knowledge of transitive word order, such that they can interpret sentences with novel verbs. So there's two theories, well, two relatively recent theories. There's Fischer's one-to-one mapping hypothesis is the first one. Now this does come from a nativist tradition. Interestingly, this is one thing I find really interesting in this. Fischer actually rejects some of the traditional nativist ideas. So, for example, she explicitly rejects Pinker's innate linking rules on the basis that this view requires considerable syntactic knowledge on the part of the child to use structural cues. So she argues that Pinker attributes too much syntactic knowledge to the 2-year-old, which I find quite refreshing. What she argues that children have instead is an unlearned bias to map nouns and sentences with participant roles in events. So basically you have something like the dog bit the man, you have 2 nouns, the dog and the man, and you have 2 participant roles that you map these onto, the agent of the action and the patient of the action. So your bias is when you have 2 nouns to map them onto different roles. And what you can do in this way is you can very quickly interpret transitive sentences. So you know that the dog bit the man or the bunny is glorping the duck refers to 2 different participant roles, an agent and an action. And you can do that with very little knowledge of syntax. So what they argue is that even partial sentence representations guide your initial interpretation. And this is the basis for subsequent learning. So you start to learn your abstract syntax system based on these preliminary partial representations. A more modern constructivist view is the graded representations view that Kirsten Abbott-Smith and Mike Tomasello first proposed and then has been summarised in a later paper by Elena and Mike. The basis from this theory is still a kind of item-based constructionist view. So you still start out with not with innate knowledge or not with abstract categories, but you start out with your speech stream. So the idea here is that you start out maybe learning a few rote-learned phrases like want biscuit, want drink, want cuddle. Your distributional analyzer picks up the similarities in form and meaning between these things. So you see the verb want always comes first and then what you want comes later. So you generalize to a more abstract category or lexically based schema where you know if after want you can put anything that you want. And again, the process is just more and more abstraction as you go along. So eventually you notice a commonality between want and need, and you create a more semi-abstract category. And again, your process is a process of everything becoming more and more abstract on the basis of commonalities in form and meaning. But interestingly, just like in Fischer's theory, at some point the children have kind of semi-abstract representation. So not full adult-like knowledge, not lexically specific knowledge, but partial representations. So at this point, for example, your item-based argument structure is not really based around lexical items, but weakly interconnected with others, which are semantically and functionally related. Okay. So Fischer and Tomasello by no means agree about how children learn syntax. So just to give one example, they disagree about what innate knowledge underlies these partial sentence representations. So Lids, Gleitman and Gleitman have suggested that Fischer's one-to-one mapping principle is based on a sort of theta criterion, a linguistic interface principle that requires semantic arguments are syntactically realized, and that's a kind of Chomskyan nativist idea or a Baker idea. Goldberg, looking at Tomasello's theory, has suggested actually no, the one-to-one mapping idea is more to do with a pragmatic principle that you kind of assume if you mention 2 participants, both those participants are relevant to the sentence. So it's a kind of Gricean pragmatic principle that the referents are going to be relevant, otherwise you wouldn't have used them. So there are points of disagreement. But there are also really important points of agreement. So both propose partial representations on the way to adult-like knowledge. So, and these partial representations are then built into syntactic categories. Both actually cite relatively similar cognitive mechanisms. So, for example, analogical reasoning is something that both feel very important. In Fischer's case, the children are aligning participant roles and semantic roles. In Tomasello's case, the children are aligning sort of lexical formulae to build up abstract categories. Both are citing the similar cognitive mechanisms. And actually, Fischer's idea does have some similarities to some of the earlier constructivist ideas. So Bauman, for example, has argued that children could start out with agent-patient categories, so semantic categories. Brain, the arch constructivist empiricist, if you like, actually suggests that the predicate argument structure might be innate. So this distinction between nouns and non-nouns could actually be an innate conceptual primitive, and that to me seems very similar. We're talking in Fischer is talking in similar terms, so there's more points of agreement. So my point is not that we're agreeing about what is innate, but we are at least agreeing about what potentially could be innate in language acquisition. Okay. Perhaps more importantly, we're coming to an agreement about how to interpret the data. So we're not now looking at the same body of evidence and going, I think that and I think that. We're actually starting to come to some agreement about what our evidence means and what would distinguish between two different theories. So remember earlier I talked about determiners like a and the. And I said that the problem was that Valian had these criteria that were based on the assumption children are learning abstract categories, and Pine and Martindale suggested that they could actually be passed with some lexical knowledge. In recent years, Julian Pine and Virginia Valian have come to an agreement about how to analyse whether children have a determiner category. So it looks like hell has frozen over after all. And what they agree on is that we should be using an overlap measure. So the predictions that they both agree are predictions from their theories are this. If the child has a category that includes a and the, okay, as opposed to separate knowledge about how each lexical item patterns, then any knowledge that the child acquires about one member of the category should immediately be available for use in another. In other words, if you know that you can say a dog, you immediately know that you can say the dog. If you know that you can say a cat, you immediately know that you can say the cat. And the simile for a mouse. So if children have a determiner category, that in their production data there should be quite a lot of overlap between their use of the determiners with different nouns. Because once you know how to use a, you can also use the in the same situation. So if Valiant's right, overlap should be quite high. In fact, to operationalize it, the overlap in children's speech should be the same as the overlap in adult speech. Okay? If adults and children are both working with abstract categories, you should see the same amount of overlap. If the child's knowledge is more limited in scope, you should have a lower level of overlap. So if children know how to use a in there's a frame and how to use the in that's a and a there's the frame, then you're going to have less overlap. And importantly, you're going to have less overlap than in the adult data. So if the children's knowledge is different to adults, you're going to have less overlap in their data. So using this overlap measure means that you can look at the data with the same measure and test whose theory is correct. Unfortunately, this doesn't mean we have come to a consensus about whether young children do or do not have abstract categories of the determiner, but there is some progress. The problem that we have at the moment is the fact that we're still arguing about how to apply the overlap analysis, I'm afraid. So here's a debate, right? So Valian in a paper in 2009 said that Pine's results underestimated children's knowledge because they're based on small samples of data and include nouns that only occur once with a determiner. So she's right in that latter thing. If you have a noun that only occurs once, it just can't occur it can't occur with overlap. So if you've just got an n of 1, there's no way you can find overlap. So she argues that you need to change what you include in your analysis, and she changes what she includes in the analysis, and she finds no difference between mothers and children's levels of overlap. So that you've got the mums in the little squares and the children in the little circles, and you have no evidence of any difference, suggesting that children's and adults' knowledge is the same. Julian Pine has suggested that she's wrong. that she's failed to control for noun identity, and importantly, because she's used a really wide range of determiners, so she's used at and the and that and which one, lots and lots of different determiners, she has actually reduced the sensitivity of her analysis, and she's made it harder to find a difference between children and adults. And he does a different analysis where he controls for nouns and he only looks at and the, and he does find, so this is within subjects analysis, so you're comparing the adult, you're comparing a child to her own mother or her own father, and what you find is that there is actually a significant difference between the red squares, which are the adult, and the blue, I don't know, diamonds, which are the children. So if you apply Gillian Pine's analysis, you get a significant difference between adults and children, and if you apply Valian's, you don't. But okay, so you could be pessimistic about that, but I'm quite optimistic because at least they're both using the same analysis and they agree, finally, on what predictions their theories make. So there's progress. Finally, in my last 10 minutes, well, I'm going to look at consensus about the role of the environment. I think that is still on. All language researchers, as far as I'm aware, are now agreeing that one of the most important learning mechanisms behind acquisition is distributional learner. So pretty much we all agree that now, anyway, that children are using information from the distribution of words in the sentence to link words that behave in similar ways and have similar meanings and extract the patterns that govern this behaviour. Now, this isn't actually new. Everyone sort of paid lip service to this in the past. But because people, nativists in particular, thought that the input wasn't interesting because it was impoverished, this was largely ignored as a topic in the nativist literature. So when the input was analysed, it was usually only to check whether it provided the evidence to, for example, distinguish between different parameters or different grammars, for example. So really there wasn't any nativist work done looking at the input and how it affected the learner. This started to change in the 1990s, where people like Jenny Safran and Rebecca Gomez started producing some really clever experiments on infants, suggesting that children have a really great ability to do statistical or distributional learning. So just to give you two examples of this, Jenny Safran has shown that children can segment speech at 8 months of age based on transitional probabilities. So if you give babies a continuous speech stream made up of nonsense syllables. So here we've got bidaku, pedoti, galabu, bidaku. Importantly, this speech stream is made up of 3-syllable nonsense words. What this means is that every time you get da, you always get ku after it. So the transitional probabilities between syllables in one word are always 100%. But every time you hear ku, you only hear pa after it a third of the time. Because sometimes it will be bidoki will be followed by padoti, sometimes it will be followed by galabu, and there's another word that I should have written on there and I haven't. And basically what infants can do, this is the only cue to segmenting these speech stream into words, and infants can use it at 8 months of age. So they pay more attention to, I can't remember which way around it is, they pay more attention in a test phase to words that they've heard already compared to part words than they do to words that they haven't heard already. So they can use transitional probability to segment speech. They can also use them to learn a simple artificial grammar. So Rebecca Gomez has shown that if you teach children an artificial grammar with very simple rules, even if the test sentences are of different lengths, as long as they all follow the same set of grammatical rules, then you test children against new sets of sentences that either do or do not follow the grammatical rules. You find they pay more attention, they listen longer to sentences that follow those familiar grammatical rules. So it looks like children can use distributional analysis in order to parse their speech stream and maybe even build up grammatical categories. So nativists and constructivists are now starting to think that language learning, as Safran says, may actually be best characterised as resulting from innately biased statistical learning mechanisms rather than innate knowledge. And this is the bit that nativists have conceded, that statistical learning is important, and this is the bit that constructivists have conceded, that they're innately biased. So let's take an example of a nativist theory that is arguing for an important constraints on the distributional analyzer. So Toby Mintz's study in 2003 on frequent frames. So Mintz has proposed that you can actually extract grammatical categories like nouns and verbs from the distribution of your sentences in the input. So he looked at whether you could extract the grammatical categories from frequent frames, frequently occurring ordered pairs of words with any word intervening. So the question here is, can you categorize the A words into the same grammatical category based on their presence in the XAY frame? And in fact that he found that you could. So what he did is he analysed the input to children in the childers corpus. So this, for example, is from Peter. And he took all the frames that were relatively frequent. I think he took the 45 most frequent frames in each child's input. So what you can see here is the words that occur in a you, x, it frame. And what he found, and what you can see here, is that you can actually, most of the words, if not all of the words that occur in a you, x, it frame are verbs. So if you put all those words in that frame together in a verb category, just based on that frame, you would be pretty accurately classifying your words as verbs. And what he found across a number of children and a number of frames was that the process is actually pretty accurate. It's not complete, but it is accurate. You can categorize words into word classes, into nouns and verbs and adjectives based on their occurrence in frequent frames. So Mintz's theory comes from the nativist tradition, and he argues that once you have classified word class categories by distributional means, you then have to link them to innate, pre-given syntactic categories. So, and once you've linked them to the innate category label, so you've linked them to the category label noun, you then have available all the sort of innate syntactic privileges associated with these categories. So once you've linked, I don't know, your words in the UX frame to the verb category, then you realize that this is a phrasal head, for example. So most constructivists would disagree with that bit, but still it's progress, because we are starting to reach a consensus about what you can learn from the input and about what kinds of information you can get out from the input. And then my final point is about frequency, and this is something really close to my heart, because it's frustrated me for years that nativists won't pay attention to frequency, but hey, they are now. The problem that we had a long time ago was there was a lack of consensus about the role of frequency. So this is something that happened to me all the time at conferences. We would go to conferences and maybe present, I don't know, Anna Theakston's paper from 2004, which showed you that the order of acquisition of the verbs in transitive sentences, so the bunny is glorping the duck, and in intransitive, so the bunny is glorping, this was predicted by the verb's frequency in the input, statistically significantly predicted. There was a massively high correlation between frequency of verbs and order of acquisition. And then I would have endless debates with nativists who said, but you can't explain everything with frequency because, for example, French children omit determiners as often as Italian children, even though they hear far fewer bare nouns in their input. So why are they omitting determiners equally often when they're hearing more determiners in their input? But once again, we're seeing a consensus. So we, Ben Ambridge, Evan Kidd, Anna Theakston and I wrote a target article in the Journal of Child Language this year where we summarised all the evidence for frequency effects in language acquisition. And we had commentaries and we had a lot of responses from people, and nobody disagrees. Yay, nobody disagrees with us that frequency is important. And these are the kinds of effects that we found. So you find effects in single word acquisition. The order of acquisition of nouns, verbs, adjectives and function words is predicted by their frequency in the input. Children pick up high frequency items first. Error rates. High frequency items are protected from error. You are less likely to make an error on a high frequency word than you are on a low frequency word in, say, a repetition experiment. There are frequency effects in inflectional morphology. So Eva Dabrowska has shown that you get frequency effects on noun case marking inflections in Polish. High frequency case marked inflections are protected from error and are learned earlier than low frequency ones. You get frequency effects in simple and complex syntactic constructions. Barnard and Matthews showed that children are quicker and less error prone to repeat high frequency forward sequences than low frequency forward sequences. So they're much better at repeating a cup of tea than they are at repeating a cup of milk. And again, in complex syntax, frequency protects you from error. Children make a lot more errors on questions which are of low frequency in their input. So they hear a lot of why don't, or why can't. They're protected from error. Kids say, why can't you do it, not why can you can't do it. They don't make inversion errors on high frequency question types. So we won the frequency argument, but it's absolutely true, as the nativists have been saying for ages, that frequency is a probabilistic, not a deterministic predictor. Order of acquisition and frequency does not correlate at 1 or even at 0.9 necessarily. And the reason for that is there are lots and lots of other factors that also influence whether a child will pick up a high frequency item or not. So, for example, communicative goals. It's really famous. Parents say you all the time. Children pick up I first. That's because they're not interested in what you're doing, they're interested in what they're doing. I want to do it, not you want to do it. Ease of reference identity. You're going to pick up the word ball before you're going to pick up the word democracy, even if democracy happens to be, for some bizarre reason, maybe because you were born this year, in the election year, even if democracy was more frequent in your input. And other things, alignment with prosodic boundaries, so people tend to pick up stuff which is more salient in the input. Ease of segmentation from fluent speech, ease of articulation. Children will say words that are easy to say before they say words that are hard to say. It's not rocket science, but if you have a word that's hard to say that's high frequency, you're probably not going to learn it or produce it. And also whether you're tested in a wide range of contexts. Children will pick up words that they hear in a whole diverse syntactic frames rather than just they hear all the time in one frame. So we are right, there is not a deterministic role of frequency, but it is an effect, and the fact that everyone's admitted that there's an effect of frequency is really, really cheering, because once you admit there's an effect of frequency, it allows you to explore what else influences children get from the input. In other words, it allows you to explore what constrains the learning process. So let's for example, Slobin showed back in the 1970s that in languages where case marking is marked on the noun as an affix on the noun, so an ending on the noun, the children seem to master the case marking system, or at least start to learn it earlier than when the case marker is marked, say, separately on a determiner. So for some reason, it seems to be easier to learn an inflection system that's marked at the end of a noun than one that's marked separately on a determiner. And Slobin argued that's because children are innately biased to pay attention to the ends of words. So there's an innate constraint. You have something that can't be explained by frequency, so you go and look at what might be able to explain it. Similarly, word serial position. Children seem to learn, in Dutch and in German, children seem to learn non-finite verb forms earlier than finite forms. So infinitive forms in English, they learn them earlier than finite forms, and it's probably, and even if they're not as frequent, and it's probably because they occur at the end of sentences in German. So German's a V2 language, so your non-finite form will come at the end, but your finite form will come in the middle of the sentence. So Daniel Freudenthal et al. Have been looking at explaining whether children have a word serial position bias, in that they pay more attention and are more likely to learn words that occur at the ends of sentences. So admitting that frequency is a factor is really important, because it then allows you to ignore the effects that are due to frequency and then look at what else needs to be explained. And that's really a productive way of looking at language learning. Okay, so my conclusion. Our initial conflict is giving way, I think, although I am known to be an optimistic, rather over-optimistic sometimes, but anyway, I think it's giving way to an emerging consensus. So the question that we're asking now really is, how do children's learning mechanisms exploit information in the environment to build mature linguistic knowledge? So we're kind of moving away from is it innate or is it environment to a much more interesting question, which is how do children do it? So the questions that are interesting is sort of how might the environment support learning? And I think we pretty much agree that provides input to learning mechanisms, and people are starting to agree that the mechanisms are things like a frequency-sensitive distributional analyzer, analogical reasoning, error-based learning is something that people are really interested in, whether you learn by predicting and then having your predictions disconfirmed. Does the environment support learning by triggering innate knowledge? There's some new kinds of probabilistic parameter setting models which might be quite interesting, which see as the role of an input. The second kind of question that's interesting is what kind of knowledge might be innate. And again, everybody is starting to look more broadly at what kinds of constraints might bias the learning mechanisms. So people are starting to consider semantic roles, conceptual distinctions, perceptual or motor biases like the AS preference that we heard about earlier. Does syntactic knowledge bias the learning mechanism? I don't know, I'm too much of a constructivist to say that it does, but if you provide me with the evidence, you know, empirical evidence is everything. If you provide me with the evidence that the theory is supported. Domain general or domain specific is kind of becoming a moot point, really. I don't really care whether the biases are domain general or domain specific. If you tell me what the bias is, you know, if there's evidence for an agent bias, I don't really care whether it's cognitive or linguistic or whatever. It's an agent bias, that's what matters. So I think that's kind of becoming less of an important question. But perhaps most importantly, this poisonous competence performance distinction is no longer important. And this is part of the scientific method. You can only test what children do. There's no point saying, oh, well, they do that, you know, they fail to do that for performance reasons. They have the competence inside their head. If you can't get to the competence, I don't care. So this, but importantly, other people seem to be agreeing with me about this. We can get rid of the competence performance distinction, and everyone's agreeing that all theories must make distinct predictions about behaviour that can be tested. And I think that if Popper is right, which he probably is, that is the way that we can move forward. And that's me done, pretty much 60 minutes. Thank you for listening. And if you wanted to look up our new Lucid Centre, the website is now live. Thank you.